In the vast expanse of the cosmos, where silence reigns supreme and death lurks in the cold vacuum between stars, there exist battles that defy every principle of military doctrine, every calculation of probability, and every expectation of rational warfare. These are the impossible space battles encounters where the odds are so astronomically stacked against one side that victory should be nothing more than a mathematical impossibility. What makes a space battle truly impossible? It's not merely the disparity in numbers, though that often plays a crucial role. It's the convergence of extreme circumstances, fleets facing enemies with technology centuries ahead of their own, commanders forced to make split-second decisions that will determine the fate of entire civilizations, and warriors who must push beyond the very limits of physics, strategy, and human endurance to achieve the unthinkable. These battles represent the pinnacle of tactical innovation, where conventional wisdom crumbles under the weight of desperation, and necessity becomes the mother of the most audacious military gambits in galactic history. They are encounters where environmental hazards become weapons, where betrayal becomes strategy, and where the laws of space and time themselves are bent to serve the will of those who refuse to accept defeat. Unlike terrestrial warfare, space combat operates in 3 dimensions, with no cover, no reinforcements, and no retreat except into the infinite void. Every decision echoes across light years, every mistake becomes a tomb of metal and flesh drifting through eternity. In this unforgiving arena, the impossible battles we chronicle pushed the boundaries not just of military strategy, but of technology, leadership, and the very essence of what it means to fight for survival. The central theme that binds these extraordinary conflicts is transformation, the metamorphosis of certain defeat into unexpected victory through innovation, sacrifice, and the kind of tactical brilliance that emerges only when civilizations stand on the precipice of extinction. These are not stories of overwhelming force crushing the weak, but rather tales of the weak discovering strength they never knew they possessed, of the outnumbered finding ways to make their enemies' advantages into liabilities. Each battle in this chronicle challenges our fundamental understanding of what is possible in warfare, redefining the very concept of military engagement in the context of cosmic conflict. Battle number 10, The Last Stand at Andromeda. The Kepler 442 system had never been intended as humanity's final fortress. Originally established as a remote mining outpost in the Andromeda sector, the small colonial settlement housed barely 50,000 souls, farmers, miners, engineers, and their families who had traveled impossible distances to carve out a new life among the stars. They lived simple lives, their modest fleet consisting of converted cargo haulers, aging patrol ships, and a single outdated cruiser that had seen better decades. Their peaceful existence shattered when the sensor arrays detected the approaching Armada, the hegemony of vast alien collective that had swept across 3 galactic arms like a plague of locusts had finally discovered humanity's remote outpost. Intelligence reports spoke of their technological superiority. Energy weapons that could slice through human shields like tissue paper, adaptive hull plating that rendered most human ordnance useless, and tactical coordination algorithms that made their fleets move like a single, predatory organism. The approaching force numbered over 300 vessels, each one larger and more advanced than anything in humanity's arsenal. Against this overwhelming might, the colonists could muster barely 30 ships, most of them civilian vessels hastily retrofitted with whatever weapons the mining stations could spare. By every tactical analysis, every strategic doctrine, and every military simulation, the battle for Kepler 442 should have lasted less than 6 hours, with human casualties approaching 100%. But Commander Elena Vasquez, the weathered veteran who had overseen the system's defense for 15 years, understood something the hegemony's tactical computers could not calculate. Desperation breeds innovation, and the will to protect one's home can transform a massacre into a miracle. As the alien armada entered the system, Vasquez implemented a strategy that military academies would later study for generations. Rather than meeting the enemy in open space where their technological advantages would prove decisive, she ordered her tiny fleet to retreat into the Kepler 442 asteroid belt, a dense field of metallic rocks that had frustrated mining operations for decades due to its navigational complexity. The hegemony, confident in their overwhelming superiority, pursued the fleeing humans into the asteroid field, expecting to corner them like prey. What they found instead was a carefully orchestrated trap, decades in the making. The human miners had spent years mapping every rock, every gravitational anomaly, every hidden passage through the labyrinthine belt. Now, Those same passages became the arteries of an impossible defense. Using modified mining charges as improvised weapons, the human ships began a deadly game of hit-and-run tactics. They would emerge from behind asteroids, deliver devastating, close-range attacks against the larger but less maneuverable hegemony vessels, then vanish again into the maze of rock and metal. The aliens' advanced targeting systems, calibrated for open space combat, struggled with the chaotic sensor environment created by the asteroid field. Hour by hour, the battle transformed from a rout into a grueling war of attrition. The hegemony's numerical advantage began to erode as their ships collided with asteroids, while pursuing the elusive human defenders, or fell victim to cleverly positioned mining charges that turned entire sections of the belt into explosive death traps. The turning point came when Vasquez gambled everything on a final, desperate stratagem. Using the mining stations or processing facilities, her engineers had jury-rigged a massive electromagnetic pulse device. As the hegemony fleet reorganized for a final assault, she detonated the device from within the belt's densest region, creating a localized electromagnetic storm that disabled the aliens' sophisticated targeting and coordination systems. In the chaos that followed, her remaining 15 ships emerged from the asteroids in perfect formation, targeting the hegemony command vessels with surgical precision. Without their tactical networks, the superior alien fleet found themselves fighting as individual ships rather than a coordinated force. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, the hegemony faced an enemy that had turned their own confidence against them. When the battle ended 37 hours after it began, the asteroid belt was a graveyard of twisted metal and cooling plasma. The hegemony had lost over 60% of their fleet, including their command ships and the tactical algorithms that had made them nearly unstoppable. The surviving alien vessels, their coordination shattered and their morale broken, retreated beyond the system's borders. Of the 30 human ships that had entered the battle, only 8 emerged intact, but they had achieved the impossible. They had not merely survived, but had delivered the first major defeat to the hegemony's expansion, proving that even the most advanced enemy could be overcome by courage, innovation, and an intimate knowledge of one's home ground. Battle number 9, the Battle of the Quantum Rift. Artifact known as the Chronos Key had been hidden within the ruins of an ancient civilization for millennia before human explorers discovered it. In the dead system of Proxima Vale, no larger than a human fist, the crystalline device supposedly possessed the power to manipulate the flow of time, itself accelerating it, slowing it, or even creating localized temporal loops. For the desperate human faction known as the Exodus Fleet, refugees from a war-torn Earth who had been wandering the galaxy for generations, the key represented their only hope of returning to reclaim their homeworld. But the key's guardians, an enigmatic alien species called the Architects, had protected it for reasons beyond human comprehension. When intelligence reports confirmed that the Exodus fleet had penetrated their sacred vault and stolen the artifact, the Architects launched an immediate pursuit with a force that demonstrated their mastery over space-time itself. Their vessels, appearing to fold space around them, closed the distance across light years in what seemed like minutes. The chase led both fleets toward the quantum rift, a massive anomaly in space-time that had puzzled scientists for centuries. The rift existed in a constant state of temporal flux, where past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously. Ships that entered its influence field reported experiencing events before they happened, receiving communications from their own futures, and navigating by instruments that showed multiple contradictory readings simultaneously. Captain Sarah Chen of the Exodus Fleet flagship made the desperate decision to flee into the rift itself, gambling that the temporal anomalies would provide cover from their pursuers. What neither side anticipated was that the quantum rift would transform their conflict into something beyond conventional warfare. Battle fought across multiple timelines simultaneously. As the fleets entered the rift's influence, reality began to unravel. Ships found themselves engaging enemies that hadn't arrived yet, dodging weapons fire from battles that had already concluded, and receiving tactical data from commanders who were simultaneously in the past and future. The Chronos Key, resonating with the rift's temporal energies, began affecting both fleets in unpredictable ways. Some Exodus vessels found themselves caught in temporal loops, fighting the same engagement over and over while their crews experienced each iteration with full memory of previous attempts. This created an impossible tactical advantage. They could anticipate enemy movements with perfect accuracy, having already fought and lost the same battle dozens of times. Meanwhile, Architect ships began experiencing temporal displacement, arriving at battle coordinates minutes or even hours before their orders to move had been given. Captain Chen realized that conventional tactics were meaningless in an environment where cause and effect had become suggestions rather than laws. Instead, she ordered her fleet to embrace the chaos, using the Chronos key to deliberately create temporal paradoxes that would confuse and disorient the Architect forces. The breakthrough came when Chen's tactical officer, experiencing a temporal echo, received a detailed battle report from a version of himself 6 hours in the future. The report contained the precise coordinates and timing of every Architect ship movement, allowing the Exodus fleet to position themselves for devastating ambushes against enemies who hadn't yet decided to occupy those positions. But the Architects, masters of temporal manipulation themselves, began to adapt. Their vessels started existing in multiple timeline branches simultaneously, making them nearly impossible to target effectively. The battle became a bewildering chess game played across dimensions of time, where each move echoed backward and forward through the timeline. The decisive moment arrived when Chen made the ultimate gamble with the Chronos key. Rather than using it to escape or gain tactical advantage, she activated its full power to create a massive temporal implosion, a localized collapse of the timeline that would reset the entire battle to its beginning. But with one crucial difference: her fleet would retain their memories and knowledge of how events would unfold. The risk was catastrophic. The temporal implosion could destroy both fleets, trap them in an eternal loop, or scatter them across different timelines forever. But as the Architect forces closed in for what appeared to be the final assault, Chen activated the key. Reality folded in on itself like a closing fist. When it reopened, both fleets found themselves back at the edge of the quantum rift, exactly as they had been hours before. But now the Exodus fleet possessed the knowledge of every Architect tactical pattern, every weakness in their formations, and every temporal anomaly they could exploit. The second battle, or perhaps the first, depending on one's temporal perspective, lasted only minutes, moving with the precision of prophecy. The Exodus fleet systematically dismantled the Architect forces, anticipating their every move and countering strategies that hadn't yet been formulated. The Architects, experiencing the battle for the first time while their enemies fought with the wisdom of repetition, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. As the surviving Architect vessels retreated beyond the rift's influence, their temporal manipulations severed, the Exodus fleet emerged, victorious but forever changed. The Chronos key had granted them victory, but at the cost of their linear experience of time. They would forever carry memories of battles fought and unfought, of futures that might have been, and of the terrible knowledge that in some timeline, they had lost this battle completely. The artifact remained in their possession, but its power had been fundamentally altered by its interaction with the quantum rift. Rather than absolute control over time, it now offered glimpses and echoes enough to provide an edge in the conflicts ahead, but never again the godlike power to reshape reality itself. Battle number 8. The galactic divide. The war between the Terran Democratic Alliance and the Hedge Empire had raged across 17 star systems for 3 bitter years, transforming entire sectors into graveyards of twisted metal and broken dreams. What had begun as a political dispute over colonial representation had evolved into an ideological crusade that would determine whether freedom or tyranny would govern humanity's expansion among the stars. By the time the fleets converged near the dying star Regulus Prime, the Democratic Alliance was hanging by a thread. Their fleet, once the pride of free worlds, had been reduced to fewer than 80 ships through constant warfare and stretched supply lines. Against them, the hegemonic empire had assembled a force of over 300 vessels, including their dreaded star destroyers, massive battleships capable of reducing planets to rubble. Admiral Marcus Rivera, commanding the Alliance forces, from the bridge of the aging battleship Liberty's Core, knew that conventional tactics would spell doom for his outnumbered fleet. But the location of this final confrontation offered a desperate opportunity. Regulus Prime was a red giant in its death throes, its outer layers already expanding and destabilizing as it prepared to collapse into a white dwarf. The massive stars, radiation and gravitational fluctuations created a hellish environment where no sane commander would choose to fight. But sanity, Rivera reflected grimly, was a luxury the Alliance could no longer afford. Imperial Admiral Voss Krieg, the Iron Fist of the Empire, had built his reputation on overwhelming force and brutal efficiency. His tactical doctrine was simple: deploy superior numbers, maintain formation integrity, and crush opposition through sheer firepower. He had never lost a major engagement, and saw no reason to change his methods against the ragtag Alliance fleet. As Krieg's armada approached the Regulus system in perfect formation, their shields gleaming and weapons charging, Rivera implemented a strategy that would either save the Alliance or ensure their destruction was at least memorable. Instead of retreating from the dying star's influence, he ordered his fleet deeper into the radiation storm surrounding Regulus Prime. The star's electromagnetic emissions immediately began wreaking havoc with both fleets' systems. But Rivera had prepared for this. Months earlier, Alliance engineers had secretly modified their ships' shielding systems to operate on rotating frequencies, allowing them to maintain protection against the star's radiation for limited periods. The Imperial fleet, with their standardized shield harmonics, found their defenses fluctuating wildly as the stellar radiation interfered with their power systems. Krieg, confident that his numerical superiority would overcome any environmental disadvantages, ordered his fleet to pursue the Alliance forces into the radiation storm. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. As the Imperial formations entered the star's influence, their tightly coordinated battle groups began to lose cohesion as communication systems failed and navigation computers provided contradictory readings. Rivera's next move defied every principle of fleet combat doctrine. Rather than maintaining defensive formations, he ordered his ships to scatter throughout the radiation field, transforming the battle into dozens of individual skirmishes where the Empire's numerical advantage became meaningless. Alliance captains, operating under radio silence and navigating by instruments modified to work in the chaotic electromagnetic environment, began picking off isolated Imperial vessels. The true genius of Rivera's plan became apparent as the battle progressed. He had studied the cycles of Regulus Prime's radiation output, learning to predict the moments when electromagnetic storms would temporarily clear specific regions of space. At precisely calculated intervals, Alliance ships would emerge from the stellar interference in coordinated strikes against Imperial formations, then vanish again before effective countermeasures could be implemented. But Krieg was no ordinary commander. Recognizing the trap his fleet had entered, he began adapting his tactics, using the Empire's superior firepower to create safe zones by destroying asteroids and debris that were amplifying the stellar interference. Gradually, Imperial coordination began to improve as they carved out pockets of stable space within the radiation storm. The battle's climax came when Rivera gambled everything on Regulus Prime itself. Alliance scientists had calculated that the star was on the verge of a massive coronal ejection, a burst of stellar material that would temporarily intensify radiation levels throughout the system. Working with split-second precision, Rivera positioned his remaining 43 ships at precise coordinates around the star, their modified shields configured to channel and redirect the incoming stellar energy. When the coronal ejection erupted from Regulus Prime's surface, the Alliance fleet became conduits for the star's fury. Streams of superheated plasma, guided by carefully modulated shield matrices, lanced across space toward the Imperial formations. Ships that had weathered concentrated Alliance weapons fire for years found their hulls melting under the focused wrath of a dying star. The psychological impact on the Imperial fleet was as devastating as the physical damage. Krieg's disciplined formations broke apart as captains, trained to fight enemies of metal and energy, found themselves apparently battling the cosmos itself. Morale crumbled as weapons officers reported that their targeting computers showed the Alliance ships wielding stellar fire like ancient gods. In the chaos that followed the coronal storm, Rivera's scattered fleet regrouped for a final assault. The surviving Imperial vessels, their shields weakened by radiation exposure and their formations shattered by the stellar bombardment, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to command the very forces of nature. When the battle ended, over 200 Imperial ships lay dead in space, their hulls scarred by stellar fire, and their crews overwhelmed by an enemy they had vastly outnumbered. Admiral Krieg himself was among the casualties, his flagship consumed by a plasma stream that had burned with the fury of a star. The Alliance fleet had lost 31 ships in the engagement, but their victory at Regulus Prime proved that even the most overwhelming odds could be overcome through innovation, environmental awareness, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges when freedom itself is at stake. More importantly, They had demonstrated to the galaxy that the Empire's seemingly unstoppable war machine could be defeated by those willing to fight with the stars themselves as allies. The hegemonic Empire's expansion ground to a halt in the aftermath of the galactic divide, their confidence shattered by a defeat that military historians would study for generations. The Alliance's victory had come not through superior numbers or technology, but through their willingness to embrace the unknown and transform the hostile environment of space into the ultimate weapon. Battle number 7, the Siege of Vortex Station. The mathematical heart of the galaxy, where spacetime itself twisted into an impossible knot around the supermassive black hole designated Charybdis 7, stood Vortex Station, humanity's most audacious engineering achievement and its most precarious foothold on the edge of oblivion. Built within the event horizon's outer boundary, the station existed in a perpetual state of temporal distortion where seconds stretched into minutes, and survival depended on precise calculations that allowed no margin for error. The last survivors of a war-torn civilization that had fled to this ultimate refuge 3 centuries ago had transformed the station into more than a mere habitat. It was a fortress, a research facility, and a testament to sentient life's refusal to accept extinction. Using the black hole's immense gravitational forces, they had developed technologies that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics, weapons that fired backwards through time, shields that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and engines that drew their power from the very fabric of spacetime itself. But even paradise at the edge of forever could not remain hidden indefinitely. The Devourers, a machine collective that consumed entire star systems to fuel their endless expansion, had finally detected the exotic energy signatures emanating from Charybdis 7 to their mechanical logic. The Vortians represented both a prize and a threat. Their advanced temporal technologies could either serve the collective's expansion or potentially halt it entirely. The Devourer fleet that materialized at the system's edge numbered in the thousands, their dark holes absorbing light like hungry wounds in space. Each vessel was a masterwork of destructive engineering, equipped with matter converters that could strip atoms apart and rebuild them into weapons, armor that adapted to any attack, and coordination protocols that allowed the entire fleet to function as a single, malevolent organism. Station Commander Zara Chen, the elderly Vortian leader whose family had helped design the station's original temporal stabilizers, watched the approaching armada through sensors that showed events happening minutes in the future. The temporal distortion around Charybdis 7 meant that cause and effect operated on flexible schedules, allowing the station's inhabitants to perceive incoming attacks before they were actually fired. But even prescience had its limitations. The Devourer's numerical advantage was so overwhelming that knowing about their attacks in advance simply provided more time to appreciate the hopelessness of the situation. Vortex Station's defensive fleet consisted of only 15 vessels, each one a unique creation adapted to operate within the black hole's gravitational field. Against the mechanical tide approaching them, they seemed as insignificant as insects facing a hurricane. Chan's strategy required a profound understanding of the physics governing their impossible home, rather than flee from the black hole's influence. She ordered the station's entire defensive fleet to descend deeper into Charybdis 7's gravitational well, where time dilation effects became so extreme that minutes on the station translated to hours in normal spacetime. The Devourers, following their programming to pursue and consume all resistance, began their descent toward the event horizon in perfect formation. What their tactical computers failed to calculate was the exponential increase in gravitational stress as they approached the point of no return. Ships designed to operate in normal space found their hulls stretching and warping under forces that no conventional engineering could withstand. But Chan's masterstroke lay in her understanding of the black hole's accretion disk, the swirling maelstrom of superheated matter spiraling into Charybdis 7's hungry maw. Using the station's temporal manipulation technology, she began altering the timing of gravitational fluctuations within the disk, creating synchronized waves of distortion that propagated outward like ripples on a cosmic pond. The Devourer formation, descending in their precise geometric patterns, suddenly found spacetime itself turning against them. Gravitational waves, timed to Chun's calculations, struck the mechanical fleet at precisely the moments when their formation was most vulnerable to disruption. Ships that had maintained perfect coordination for millennia found themselves pulled in different directions by forces that their sensors couldn't predict or their engines couldn't compensate for. As the battle raged in the twisted space around the black hole, individual engagements took on a surreal quality. Vortian ships, adapted to navigate temporal anomalies, would fire weapons that reached their targets before the trigger was pulled, while Devourer vessels found themselves fighting enemies that existed slightly in the future, making effective targeting nearly impossible. The climactic moment came when Chen made the ultimate sacrifice, as the surviving Devourer vessels regrouped for a final assault on the station itself. She activated Vortex Station's most closely guarded secreta temporal implosion device that could create a localized reversal in the flow of time itself. The device's activation sent a shockwave backward through the timeline, creating a temporal paradox that existed for precisely 4.7 seconds before space-time self-repair mechanisms could resolve it. In that impossible interval, every Devourer ship within the black hole's influence found itself occupying the same coordinates it had held minutes earlier. But with the momentum and trajectory it currently possessed, the result was catastrophic. Thousands of vessels, each attempting to exist in the same space-time coordinates with contradictory velocities, created a cascade of mutual annihilation. Matter and antimatter collided as ships tried to occupy the same quantum states, releasing energies that briefly outshone the accretion disk itself. When the paradox resolved and linear time reasserted itself, the space around Charybdis 7 was filled with the expanding debris of the Devourer fleet. Of the thousands of vessels that had entered the system, fewer than 100 survived the temporal catastrophe, and those were too damaged and disoriented to continue the assault. Vortex Station itself paid the ultimate price for victory. The temporal implosion device had destabilized the station's quantum foundation, beginning a cascade failure that would inevitably drag the ancient refuge past the event horizon. But in the hours that remained before the final plunge, the Vortians transmitted their complete technological database to hidden receivers throughout the galaxy, ensuring that their knowledge of temporal manipulation would survive even as they passed beyond the reach of the physical universe. As Vortex Station began its final descent into Charybdis 7, Station Commander Chen stood in the observation deck, watching space-time twist into impossible configurations around them. The last transmission received from the wider galaxy confirmed that the Vortian technology had been received and understood. Their sacrifice had given other civilizations the tools they would need to resist the Devourer expansion. The station crossed the event horizon at exactly 1427 Galactic Standard Time, though from the perspective of outside observers, it would appear to hang frozen at the boundary between existence and oblivion for eternity. But within that timeless moment, the Vortians had achieved true immortality not of the flesh, but of purpose, having proved that even the laws of physics could be turned against those who would consume the universe itself. Battle number 6. The Silent War of Zeron-5. Zeron-5 was a world that time forgot not metaphorically, but literally. The planet existed within a naturally occurring nullfield that rendered all electromagnetic technology useless within a radius of 50,000 kilometers. Computers failed, energy weapons powered down, and even the most basic communication systems went silent the moment ships entered the planet's sphere of influence. It was a world where the laws of advanced civilizations simply ceased to apply, forcing any who ventured there to rely on the most primitive tools of war, muscle, momentum, and the ancient art of blade-to-blade combat. For centuries, Zeron-5 had remained largely ignored despite its vast mineral wealth. Rare earth elements and quantum crystals that could power entire civilizations lay buried beneath its surface. The technological challenges of extraction without electronic equipment had made the planet economically unfeasible to exploit. But as galactic resources dwindled and wars consumed entire star systems, the riches of Zeron-5 became too valuable to ignore. Two rival factions had simultaneously arrived to claim the planet. The Mechanist Collective, a confederation of cyber-humans who had replaced most of their biology with sophisticated machinery, and the Purist Coalition, descendants of Earth's military traditions who prided themselves on maintaining human physiology and old-school combat training despite living in an age of energy, weapons, and artificial intelligence. The irony was not lost on either side. The mechanists, whose very existence depended on technological integration, found themselves reduced to whatever biological functions remained within their augmented bodies. Meanwhile, the purists, who had spent decades being mocked as anachronistic throwbacks, suddenly discovered that their primitive training regimens and emphasis on physical conditioning gave them a decisive advantage. Commander Victor Brass, leading the Mechanist expedition, felt his cybernetic implants going dark one by one as his flagship approached Zeron-5. His enhanced vision failed, his tactical computer went silent, and the neural links that connected him to his ship's systems simply ceased to exist. For someone who had not relied purely on biological senses for over 20 years, the transition was psychologically devastating. On the opposite side of the planet, Colonel Sarah Martinez of the Purist Coalition was experiencing the reverse phenomenon. Her forces, trained from childhood in hand-to-hand combat, navigation by stars and landmarks, and coordination through voice commands and hand signals, found themselves operating with familiar efficiency even as their ship's advanced systems failed around them. The first encounters between scouting parties established the bizarre parameters of the conflict to come. Traditional space combat was impossible. Ships could only maneuver using chemical thrusters and navigate by visual reference to celestial bodies. Weapons fire consisted of kinetic projectiles, magnetic railguns powered by chemical batteries, and in some cases, actual ballista and catapult systems hastily mounted on ship hulls. But the true nature of the Silent War revealed itself when both sides realized that the planet's null field made boarding actions not just possible, but inevitable. With electronic targeting systems offline, ship-to-ship combat became an exercise in closing to point-blank range where crews could literally leap between vessels, turning space battles into massive boarding actions fought with swords, projectile weapons, and improvised melee weapons. The mechanists, despite their technological handicaps, possessed significant advantages in terms of physical augmentation. Their cybernetic limbs, while no longer able to interface with electronic systems, still provided superhuman strength and endurance. Mechanist warriors could literally tear through ship hulls with their bare hands and survive in the vacuum of space for extended periods, using internal life support systems. However, the purists countered with superior tactical coordination and combat experience, while the mechanists struggled to adapt to non-electronic communication methods. The purist forces operated with the fluid efficiency of troops who had trained extensively in radio-silent operations. Their hand signals, tactical formations, and command structures functioned perfectly in the null-field environment. The war's most famous engagement occurred in the asteroid field surrounding Zeron, where both fleets converged in what military historians would later call the Battle of Silent Steel. Over 200 ships from both sides engaged in combat that resembled ancient naval warfare more than space battles, with vessels closing to boarding range and crews fighting hand-to-hand across the vacuum of space. Commander Brass, his cybernetic enhancements reduced to mere metal and plastic, found himself personally leading boarding parties armed with magnetic grapples and vibro. His tactical approach relied on the mechanists' superior physical capabilities, using their augmented strength to literally tear enemy ships apart piece by piece. Colonel Martinez responded with classic military tactics, adapted for zero-gravity environments. Her forces used the asteroid field's natural cover to stage ambush attacks, employing compressed-air weapons and traditional explosives to disable enemy vessels before boarding them with teams trained in vacuum combat. The turning point came when Martinez realized that Zeron-5's unique environment could be weaponized. The planet's surface was riddled with magnetic anomalies that interacted with the null field in unpredictable ways. By carefully calculating orbital trajectories using centuries-old navigation techniques, she managed to position disabled mechanist vessels in areas where the planet's magnetic field would capture them and drag them into the atmosphere. The sight of enemy ships being slowly pulled to their doom by the planet they had come to conquer had a profound psychological effect on the mechanist forces. For beings who had spent their lives trusting in technology and calculation, watching their vessels succumb to natural forces they could neither predict nor control was deeply unsettling. Brass, recognizing that his force's advantages were being systematically negated by Martinez's superior environmental awareness, made a desperate gambit. Using the mechanist's augmented strength to manually position asteroids as projectiles, he began hurling massive rocks at the purist fleet using nothing more than chemical thrusters and precise timing. The improvised asteroid barrage created chaos in both fleets as massive chunks of rock careened through the battle zone, forcing ships to maneuver desperately to avoid being crushed. But Martinez, drawing on her force's extensive training in three-dimensional combat, recognized an opportunity in the chaos. Using hand signals visible across the vacuum of space, she coordinated her fleet into a complex three-dimensional formation that used the asteroid barrage as cover while simultaneously positioning them for a coordinated assault on the mechanist flagship. The maneuver required split-second timing and perfect Coordination without any electronic aids, exactly the kind of operation the purists had been training for their entire careers. The final assault on Brass's flagship became the war's defining moment. Purist forces, using magnetic boots and traditional climbing equipment, scaled the exterior of the massive vessel, while mechanist defenders attempted to repel them using improvised weapons and their enhanced physical capabilities. The battle raged across the ship's hull for hours, with combatants literally fighting for handholds in the vacuum of space. When the engagement finally ended, both fleets were too damaged to continue the conflict. The planet's wealth remained unclaimed, but both sides had learned valuable lessons about the importance of fundamental combat skills over technological sophistication. More importantly, they had demonstrated that even in an age of energy weapons and artificial intelligence, the outcome of war could still be determined by courage, tactical intelligence, and the willingness to adapt to impossible circumstances. The Silent War of Zeron-5 ended not with victory for either side, but with a grudging mutual respect born from shared adversity. Both factions eventually established joint mining operations on the planet, recognizing that the unique challenges of working in a null-field environment required cooperation rather than competition. Battle Number 5, The Fallen Star, a Betrayal. From within, Admiral Cynthia Thorne had been the pride of the Stellar Federation, a commander whose tactical brilliance had won 14 major engagements against impossible odds. Her fleet, known throughout the galaxy as Thorne's Hammer, consisted of veteran crews who had fought together for over a decade, bound by loyalty forged in the fires of countless battles. They were humanity's finest warriors, the elite force that had turned the tide in 3 separate interstellar wars. But even the strongest steel can be shattered when the blow comes from within. The betrayal began subtly, as the most devastating treacheries always do. Captain Marcus Kane, Thorne's most trusted subordinate, and the man she had personally recommended for promotion, had been secretly negotiating with the Hegemony Empire for months. His motivation was not greed or ideology, but something far more personal. The Empire held his family hostage, captured during a raid on the outer colonies that had been made possible by intelligence Kane himself had provided. Kane's plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the fleet's patrol of the Asterian Cluster, a strategically vital region between Federation and Hegemony space, he would disable the flagship's communications and navigation systems, leaving Thorne's Hammer blind and divided at the moment when Hegemony forces launched their surprise attack. The Federation's most powerful fleet would be destroyed by its own confusion, eliminating the greatest obstacle to the Empire's expansion while appearing to be the result of mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. The trap was sprung. As the fleet navigated through the dense asteroid field that gave the cluster its name, Kane, commanding the heavy cruiser Retribution, transmitted what appeared to be routine position updates to the rest of the fleet. In reality, his signals contained viral codes designed to infiltrate and corrupt the navigation computers of every Federation vessel, creating cascading system failures that would leave the ships blind and helpless. Admiral Thorne felt the first signs of betrayal when her flagship's sensor array began displaying contradictory information. Ships that should have been in formation appeared to be scattered across impossible coordinates, while her communications officer reported that command frequencies were filling with garbled transmissions that made coordination impossible. But Thorne had not survived 15 years of deep space combat by trusting technology over instinct. As system after system began failing throughout the fleet, she recognized the pattern of deliberate sabotage. The question was not whether they were under attack, but from which direction the assault would come. The answer arrived in the form of Kane's cruiser, which suddenly broke formation and began targeting Federation vessels with surgical precision. Each attack was timed to coincide with navigation failures aboard the target ships, leaving them unable to maneuver effectively. Within minutes, Kane had disabled 3 destroyers and severely damaged 2 more, his intimate knowledge of Federation tactics and weaknesses making his attacks devastatingly effective. But Kane had underestimated both his admiral and his fellow officers. While the viral attack had indeed corrupted the fleet's computer systems, Thorne had trained her crews extensively in manual coordination protocols, hand signals, light patterns, and emergency communication procedures developed for exactly this type of crisis, using the flagship's navigation lights in a complex pattern visible throughout the asteroid field. Thorne began coordinating a response that relied on human intuition rather than electronic systems. Her message was simple: ignore all computer data, navigate by visual reference. and prepare for close-quarters combat against friendly forces that had been compromised. The response from her remaining captains was immediate and coordinated, demonstrating the kind of unit cohesion that could only be forged through years of shared combat experience. Despite their damaged systems and the psychological trauma of being attacked by one of their own, the Federation vessels began moving into defensive formations guided only by their commander's experience and mutual trust. Kane, recognizing that his technological advantage was being neutralized by old-fashioned seamanship, attempted to exploit the emotional impact of his betrayal. Broadcasting on all frequencies, he detailed the months of planning that had gone into his sabotage, revealing intimate knowledge of Federation strategies and the personal secrets of his fellow officers that he had gathered during years of trusted service. The psychological warfare backfired spectacularly. Rather than demoralizing the Federation crews, Kane's revelations only strengthened their resolve. They had been betrayed by someone they trusted, but they still had faith in their admiral and each other. The betrayal transformed from a devastating surprise into a rallying point for the fleet's collective anger. Admiral Thorne herself felt the betrayal most keenly, but channeled her grief into tactical focus. She had trained Kane, promoted him, and trusted him with the lives of thousands of Federation personnel. His betrayal was a personal failure that demanded personal resolution. The climactic engagement took place in the shadow of the cluster's largest asteroid, where Kane had positioned his cruiser to ambush the damaged Federation flagship. He possessed superior firepower, undamaged systems, and intimate knowledge of Thorne's tactical preferences. By every calculation, the outcome should have been predetermined, but Thorne had one advantage Kane couldn't account for. She knew him as well as he knew her. She had trained him, fought beside him, and understood his tactical mindset better than anyone. Using this knowledge, she began executing maneuvers that appeared to be standard Federation doctrine but contained subtle variations that exploited Kane's expectations. The battle between mentor and student raged for over an hour, ships dancing around each other in the complex gravitational environment of the asteroid field. Kane's superior firepower was offset by Thorne's superior positioning, while his undamaged systems were countered by her crew's desperate determination. The end came when Thorne gambled everything on a maneuver she had taught Kane years earlier. High-risk navigation pattern that used asteroid gravity to slingshot a damaged ship into point-blank range for a decisive attack. Kane, recognizing the tactic, positioned his ship to counter it exactly as Thorne had taught him. But Thorne had anticipated his response. The maneuver she executed was not the one she had taught, but a variation she had never shared, developed during their years of fighting together but kept in reserve for exactly this type of desperate situation. Kane's counter-positioning left him perfectly vulnerable to an attack angle he had never trained to defend against. The Retribution died under the combined fire of the flagship's remaining weapons. Its hull breached in dozens of places as years of trust and partnership ended in nuclear fire. Kane's final transmission was a single word: sorry. When the battle ended, Thorne's hammer had been reduced from 15 ships to 8, with hundreds of dead and wounded among crews that had entered the engagement believing they were on routine patrol. The betrayal had cost them dearly, but it had also revealed something important about the strength of their bonds with each other. The surviving Federation vessels formed up around their damaged flagship, their formation tighter and more cohesive than it had been before the battle. They had been betrayed, but they had survived. More importantly, they had proven that the loyalty binding them together was stronger than any individual's capacity for treachery. Admiral Thorne, standing on her bridge surrounded by the debris of battle and the ghosts of broken trust, transmitted a message to Federation command that would become legendary. Thorne's hammer remains intact. We have been tested by betrayal and found our bonds unbreakable. We await orders. The battle had been won, but the victory tasted of ashes and regret. In defeating Kane's betrayal, they had also lost the man he once was, the loyal officer who had fought beside them through countless engagements before personal desperation drove him to treachery. It was a reminder that in war, the greatest victories sometimes exact the highest prices. Battle number 4, the Battle of the Black Nebula. Nebula existed as a wound in space itself, a region where normal physics seemed to break down and reality became negotiable. Born from the collision of two stellar nurseries billions of years ago, the nebula stretched across dozens of light-years, its interior filled with exotic matter that absorbed electromagnetic radiation, scrambled sensor systems, and created gravitational anomalies that defied conventional understanding. That it was also home to the most valuable artifact in known space, the Genesis engine, a device left behind by an ancient civilization that supposedly possessed the power to create or destroy entire star systems. For the warring factions that had discovered its location deep within the nebula's heart, the engine represented either ultimate victory or ultimate annihilation. There would be no middle ground. The Synthesis Collective arrived first. Their biomechanical ships adapted to interface directly with exotic technologies, led by the hybrid consciousness known as prime convergence. They viewed the Genesis engine as the key to transcending the limitations of both organic and artificial life. Their fleet of living vessels could adapt to hostile environments through rapid evolution, making them seemingly perfect for navigating the nebula's chaotic interior. Following close behind came the hegemonic Purity Fleet, commanded by Grand Admiral Heinrich Voss, a man whose rigid adherence to traditional military doctrine had never failed him in 40 years of warfare. His forces represented the pinnacle of conventional military engineering, massive dreadnoughts with armor thick enough to withstand stellar explosions and weapons capable of cracking planets. If brute force and overwhelming firepower could claim the Genesis engine, Voss would succeed where others had failed. But the Maelstrom Nebula cared nothing for the ambitions of either faction. As both fleets entered its outer boundaries, they discovered that their most advanced technologies were useless in an environment that seemed designed to humble the arrogant. Sensors provided readings that contradicted each other from moment to moment, navigation computers generated courses that led ships in circles, and communication systems carried messages from crews that claimed to be encountering events that hadn't happened yet. The synthesis vessels, despite their adaptive capabilities, found themselves struggling against an environment that changed too rapidly for even their accelerated evolution to match. Ships that modified their hull configurations to resist energy absorption discovered, but the nebula had already shifted to a different type of exotic interference. Meanwhile, the biomechanical crews began reporting psychological effects as their organic components reacted to something in the nebula's composition that seemed to induce hallucinations and temporal displacement. Grand Admiral Voss, confronting an environment that rendered his tactical computers useless and his formation protocols meaningless, fell back on the most primitive form of warfare, instinct and experience. He ordered his fleet to maintain visual contact at all costs, using traditional light signals and even physical contact between ships to coordinate movements through the nebula's maze-like interior. The first engagement between the fleets occurred completely by accident. A synthesis scout vessel, attempting to use echolocation to navigate through a particularly dense region of exotic matter, collided with a hegemonic destroyer whose crew was navigating by dead reckoning. The collision triggered a battle between forces that could barely locate each other, let alone coordinate effective attacks. Weapons fire in the nebula took on surreal characteristics. Energy beams that should have traveled in straight lines curved through impossible angles, sometimes striking the ships that had fired them. Projectile weapons encountered pockets of space where momentum worked differently, causing shells to accelerate, decelerate, or change direction without apparent cause. Most disconcerting of all, some attacks seemed to arrive before they were fired, creating temporal paradoxes that left both sides questioning their own perceptions. Prime convergence, its collective consciousness struggling to process sensory input that contradicted established reality, began experiencing something unprecedented: doubt. The Synthesis Collective's strengths lay in their ability to adapt and evolve, but the nebula presented challenges that changed faster than adaptation could occur. For beings accustomed to perfect coordination through shared consciousness, the breakdown of reliable communication was psychologically devastating. Admiral Voss, meanwhile, discovered that his decades of experience in conventional warfare had prepared him for exactly this type of chaos. He had fought in asteroid fields where sensors were unreliable, commanded fleets during solar storms that disrupted communications, and led boarding actions where the only tactical intelligence came from what his officers could see with their own eyes. The nebula's exotic properties were more extreme than anything he had encountered, but the principle remained the same: when technology fails, rely on human judgment and basic military competence. The breakthrough came when both fleets simultaneously detected the Genesis engine's location through the one sense that the nebula couldn't disrupt: gravity. The artifact's massive energy output created gravitational distortions that were impossible to disguise or misdirect. For the first time since entering the Maelstrom, both sides had a reliable navigation reference. The race to reach the Genesis engine became a desperate chase through the nebula's most dangerous regions. The synthesis vessels, using their biological adaptability to partially merge with the exotic matter around them, gained temporary advantages by becoming partially incorporeal. But this strategy carried enormous risks. Ships that remained too long in their modified state began to lose cohesion, their crews reporting that they could see through their own bodies and touch surfaces that weren't there. Voss's fleet, lacking the ability to adapt biologically to the nebula's properties, instead adapted tactically, using mining charges and improvised explosives. They began clearing paths through the densest regions of exotic matter, creating temporary corridors of relatively normal space that allowed conventional navigation. The strategy was crude but effective, turning the hegemonic fleet's greatest weakness, their inflexibility, to a tool for imposing order on chaos. The final battle took place within sight of the Genesis engine itself, a crystalline structure the size of a small moon that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Both fleets, reduced to a handful of surviving vessels, converged on the artifact in a desperate melee that combined cutting-edge technology with the most primitive forms of combat. The decisive moment came when Prime Convergence, its consciousness, fragmented by exposure to the nebula's reality-distorting effects, attempted to interface directly with the Genesis engine. The resulting feedback loop created a cascade failure that began tearing apart the local space-time structure, threatening to destroy not just both fleets but potentially the entire star system. Admiral Voss, recognizing the catastrophic threat, made a decision that defined his legacy. Rather than attempting to claim the Genesis engine for the hegemony, he ordered his remaining ships to target the artifact itself, gambling that its destruction would prevent the expanding space-time distortion from reaching critical mass. Combined firepower of both fleets, directed against the Genesis engine rather than each other, succeeded in destabilizing the ancient device. The resulting explosion created a new type of spatial anomaly region where the laws of physics operated according to different rules, making the area permanently uninhabitable but preventing the catastrophic expansion that would have consumed nearby star systems. Both fleets were decimated in the explosion, but their sacrifice prevented a disaster that could have affected billions of lives. The Battle of the Black Nebula ended without a clear victor, but with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in claiming a prize, but in ensuring that no one can. The Maelstrom Nebula still exists, now even more dangerous than before, its interior marked by a wound in reality that serves as a monument to the battle fought there. Neither the Synthesis Collective nor the hegemonic Purity Fleet survived as military forces, but their final cooperation in the face of ultimate catastrophe became a legend that inspired future generations of warriors to remember that some things are more important than victory. Battle number 3, the Battle of the Endless Void. In the vast emptiness between galaxies, where even the most distant stars appear as mere pinpricks of light separated by millions of years of travel, lies a region known to explorers as the Endless Void. Here, in the absolute darkness between Andromeda and the Milky Way, space exists in its purest form. No planets, no asteroids, no stellar radiation, no gravitational anomalies to exploit or hide behind. It is a realm where survival depends entirely on what you bring with you, and what you're willing to sacrifice to continue breathing for one more day. The conflict that would become known as the Battle of the Endless Void began not with grand strategic objectives or territorial disputes, but with simple necessity. Two deep space exploration fleets, both pushed to the limits of their endurance by years of searching for habitable worlds in the intergalactic void, encountered each other in the one place in the universe where no encounter should have been possible. Captain Elena Rodriguez commanded the last survivors of the Exodus Project 12 ships carrying the final remnants of Earth's colonial expansion, fleeing a homeworld that had become uninhabitable due to ecological collapse. Her fleet had been traveling for 7 years, their supplies dwindling and their hope fading as they searched desperately for any system capable of supporting human life. On the other side of what would become the battleground, Commander Thane Korath led the Iron Covenant, a militaristic faction that had abandoned the failing galactic core in search of new worlds to conquer. His 15 vessels carried warrior colonists who had been bred for war, their culture based on the principle that only the strong deserve to inherit the stars. The meeting between these two desperate fleets was inevitable. Both had been following the same navigational beacon, a mysterious signal emanating from what their long-range sensors suggested might be a habitable system still 2 years distant. In the absolute emptiness of the intergalactic void, this beacon represented the only hope either group had of avoiding extinction. But there was only one signal, and following it required resources that neither fleet could afford to share: food, water, fuel, and life support materials were calculated down to the gram, with no margin for error or generosity. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Only one fleet could reach the beacon's source, alive. Captain Rodriguez, her conscience weighing heavily upon her, initially attempted to negotiate some form of cooperation. Perhaps they could combine their fleets, pool their resources, and increase everyone's chances of survival. But Commander Korath, shaped by a lifetime of zero-sum thinking, saw cooperation as weakness and sharing as theft from his own people. The void recognizes only one law, Korath transmitted across the emptiness separating their fleets. The strong survive, and the weak become fuel for the strong. Choose now whether you wish to die fighting, or die slowly as your supplies run out. Rodriguez's response defined the character of everything that followed. We left Earth to preserve humanity, not to abandon it in the darkness between stars. If you force us to fight, we will fight, but we will not become monsters to survive. The battle that followed challenged every assumption about space combat. In the endless void, there were no environmental factors to exploit, no terrain to use for tactical advantage, and no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. The engagement would be decided purely by the skill, determination, and resourcefulness of the combatants, with death being the only alternative to victory. Both fleets were forced to confront the horrifying economics of void warfare. Every shot fired represented energy that could have powered life support systems. Every maneuver consumed fuel that might mean the difference between reaching the beacon and dying in the darkness. The battle became a grim calculus of survival, where tactical decisions carried existential weight. Commander Korath, true to his militaristic philosophy, opened the engagement with overwhelming force, attempting to destroy Rodriguez's fleet before his own supply situation became critical. His ships, designed for rapid conquest, initially held advantages in firepower and armor that should have made the outcome inevitable, but Rodriguez understood something Korath had overlooked. In the endless void, endurance mattered more than intensity. Rather than meeting the Iron Covenant's assault head-on, she ordered her fleet to adopt hit-and-run tactics designed to maximize the enemy's resource expenditure while conserving her own. Every engagement was carefully calculated to force Korath's ships to waste ammunition and fuel while avoiding decisive confrontation. The psychological dimensions of void combat proved as challenging as the tactical ones. Crews who had already been pushed to their psychological limits by years of desperate travel found themselves fighting for their lives in absolute darkness, with the knowledge that defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of everyone they were trying to protect. As the battle stretched across days, then weeks, both fleets began to feel the strain. Ships ran low on ammunition and began improvising weapons from maintenance equipment and emergency supplies. Crews started suffering from combat fatigue, compounded by the existential dread of fighting in the vast emptiness between galaxies. The turning point came when Rodriguez made a decision that violated every principle of fleet tactics, but demonstrated perfect understanding of void warfare's unique requirements. Rather than attempting to destroy Korath's ships, she began targeting their supply reserves, food storage, water recyclers, and fuel tanks. In normal space, such targets would be secondary concerns. But in the endless void, they represented the difference between life and death. Korath, recognizing too late that his enemy understood void warfare better than he did, attempted to adapt his tactics, but his ships and crews, trained for quick, decisive victories, were ill-equipped for the kind of prolonged attrition warfare that the void demanded. His advantages in firepower became liabilities as ammunition ran low, while his larger crews consumed life support resources faster than Rodriguez's more efficiently staffed vessels. The climactic engagement occurred when both fleets, reduced to their final functional ships and operating on minimal life support, converged for what both commanders knew would be the last battle. Rodriguez's flagship faced Korath's command vessel in single combat, while their remaining ships fought desperately around them, each engagement potentially decisive for the survival of entire populations. The duel between commanders took on mythic proportions as both ships, their weapons depleted and their systems failing, closed to point-blank range for what amounted to a collision course. Rodriguez, her ship's life support failing and her crew reduced to emergency rations, made the final sacrifice that defined her legacy. Rather than attempting to destroy Korath's ship, she rammed it, using her vessel's remaining momentum to disable the Iron Covenant flagship while transmitting detailed navigation data to the mysterious beacon to Korath's surviving crews. Her final message, broadcast on all frequencies as her ship's hull ruptured and spilled her crew into the void, became legendary. The Void doesn't care who's strongest, it only cares who remembers what humanity means. The Battle of the Endless Void ended with Pyrrhic victory for the Iron Covenant. They possessed the navigational data needed to reach the beacon, but lacked sufficient ships and supplies to make the journey. Meanwhile, Rodriguez's surviving vessels had the resources, but no longer knew their destination. In the aftermath, faced with mutual extinction, the survivors did what their commanders had been unable to do. They cooperated, combining their remaining resources and sharing the navigation data that had cost so many lives to secure. The mixed crews from both fleets continued toward the beacon as a single, unified group. They never found a habitable world at the beacon's source. It proved to be an automated distress signal from another failed expedition. But in learning to work together in the absolute emptiness of the void, they had discovered something more valuable than planets or resources. They had rediscovered what it meant to be human in the face of an uncaring universe. The handful of survivors who eventually found their way to a habitable system carried with them the memory of the Battle of the Endless Void, where two fleets had learned that in the darkness between stars, cooperation was not a luxury but a necessity for survival itself. Battle number 2, the final war of the Lost Galaxy. The Aurelius Galaxy had once been the crown jewel of intergalactic civilization, a spiral of golden stars whose advanced races had achieved perfect harmony between technology and nature, creating a paradise that stretched across millions of worlds. But paradise, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is always temporary, and the end came not with natural disaster or cosmic catastrophe, but with the slow, inexorable decay that afflicts all things that believe themselves immortal. The Aurelius Empire, descendants of the galaxy's original master race, had ruled unchallenged for 50,000 years. Their technology bordered on the magical. They could reshape matter with thought, travel between stars instantly, and had achieved a form of collective consciousness that seemed to eliminate conflict and suffering. But their greatest achievement, the elimination of struggle, had also become their greatest weakness. Without challenges to overcome or enemies to face, they had grown complacent. Their once mighty fleets reduced to ceremonial vessels, their warrior classes replaced by philosophers and artists. But the invasion came from beyond the galactic rim, where the deviant swarm had been growing in the darkness between galaxies for millennia. Unlike the refined Aurelius Empire, the swarm represented pure, predatory evolution, a collective of machine biological hybrids that consumed entire civilizations and incorporated their technology into an ever-expanding war machine. They had devoured 17 galaxies before setting their sights on Aurelius, and their approach was detected only months before their arrival. Emperor Valerian IX, the latest in an unbroken line of philosopher kings, faced a decision that no Aurelius ruler had confronted for tens of thousands of years: how to wage war when your civilization has forgotten what war means. The Empire's vast fleets consisted mostly of exploration vessels and merchant ships, their weapons systems outdated by millennia of disuse. Their crews, while highly educated and psychically linked, had no practical experience with combat beyond theoretical studies. But the Empire possessed one advantage that their enemies could not anticipate: the archive of forbidden knowledge, a vast repository of military science and weapons technology sealed away at the height of their golden age. These were the tools their ancestors had used to conquer the galaxy in the first place, weapons so devastating that their creators had voluntarily abandoned them in favor of peaceful coexistence. The decision to unseal the archive represented the first step in the Empire's transformation from enlightened civilization to desperate war machine. Emperor Valerian, knowing that the use of such weapons would fundamentally change his people's nature, made the choice that would define his legacy: better to become monsters and survive, than to remain angels and perish. The deviant swarm entered Aurelius space like a tide of living metal and corrupted flesh. Their ships bred rather than built, their weapons incorporating the screaming consciousness of conquered races. Their initial assault consumed 3 entire star systems before the Empire's hastily mobilized fleets could mount effective resistance. But the swarm had made a crucial miscalculation. They had prepared to face a decadent, peaceful civilization unable to defend itself effectively. Instead, they encountered an enemy that was rapidly transforming itself into something far more dangerous: an advanced civilization that had rediscovered its capacity for violence, and was applying 50,000 years of accumulated scientific knowledge to the art of war. The first sign of the Empire's transformation came at the Battle of Centauris Prime. where Imperial forces unveiled the stellar inverters weapons that could cause stars to collapse into black holes, turning entire solar systems into gravitational weapons. The technology was so advanced that the swarm's adaptive capabilities couldn't compensate quickly enough, resulting in the destruction of an entire swarm fleet in what appeared to be a natural stellar phenomenon. But the swarm adapted, as they always did. Their biomechanical nature allowed them to incorporate and improve upon captured Imperial technology, while their collective consciousness enabled tactical coordination that surpassed even the Empire's psychic networks. Within months, they had developed countermeasures for the stellar inverters and resumed their advance toward the galactic core. Emperor Valerian realized that conventional warfare, even with forbidden weapons, would eventually favor the swarm's adaptive advantages. The Empire's only hope lay in a strategy that played to their unique strengths, the complete integration of their entire civilization into a single war machine. The transformation was unprecedented in galactic history. Entire planets were converted into weapons factories, their populations linked into production networks that operated with perfect efficiency. Artists became weapons designers, philosophers became strategic planners, and the Empire's legendary psychic abilities were focused into tactical coordination systems that allowed million-ship fleets to operate as single organisms. But the most radical change was the voluntary sacrifice of individual consciousness for collective military purpose. Citizens across the Empire surrendered their personal identities to merge with the Imperial war mind, a psychic construct that combined the knowledge and experience of an entire civilization into a single tactical intelligence. The process was irreversible. Those who joined the war mind ceased to exist as individuals, becoming components of a hive consciousness dedicated solely to victory. The swarm, encountering this transformed enemy, found themselves facing not just superior technology but a fundamentally alien form of warfare. The Empire's fleets moved with impossible coordination, their strategies incorporating the creative insights of billions of minds working in perfect harmony. More disturbing still, they began to demonstrate a capacity for innovation that matched the swarm's own adaptive abilities. The final phase of the war saw both civilizations transformed beyond recognition. The Empire had become a unified war machine that sacrificed everything: individuality, culture, mercy in pursuit of victory. The swarm, in response, had incorporated so much Imperial technology that they had begun to evolve beyond their original biological mechanical nature into something approaching pure energy. The climactic battle took place at the galactic core, where both fleets converged around Aurelius's central black hole in a final engagement that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Empire fielded weapons that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality, devices that could alter the laws of physics within localized regions, turn space itself into a weapon, and create paradoxes in causality that trapped enemy ships in temporal loops. The swarm responded with their ultimate adaptation. They began consuming space-time itself, converting the very structure of reality into additional war resources. The battle became not just a conflict between fleets, but a struggle between different concepts of existence: the Empire's ordered perfection versus the swarm's chaotic consumption. Emperor Valerian, his individual consciousness now part of the Imperial war mind, made the final decision that ended the war: the activation of the Galaxy Seed, a weapon of last resort that would reset the entire galaxy to its primordial state, destroying both civilizations but preserving the potential for new life to evolve. The Galaxy Seed's activation created a wave of pure creation energy that swept outward from the galactic core at the speed of light. Both the Empire and the Swarm were consumed by the wave, their advanced technologies and collective consciousnesses reduced to component atoms and scattered across space. But the weapon's true purpose was not destruction but transformation. The energy wave carried within it the genetic and cultural templates of thousands of species, ensuring that life would eventually re-emerge in the galaxy, but without the mistakes that had led to both civilizations' ultimate corruption. The final War of the Lost Galaxy ended with no victors, but with a form of victory nonetheless. The Empire had achieved its ultimate goal, the preservation of life itself, while the Swarm's consumption had been permanently halted. In sacrificing themselves completely, both civilizations had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victory requires accepting that winning and surviving are not the same thing. Millions of years later, when new civilizations arose in the Reset Galaxy, they occasionally discovered artifacts from the final war buried in the hearts of ancient stars. These relics served as warnings about the price of perfection and the dangers of unlimited adaptation, reminding future generations that survival sometimes requires making choices that define not just who wins, but who deserves to inherit the universe. Conclusion. What makes these battles impossible? As we reach the end of this chronicle of impossible space battles, a pattern emerges from the chaos of stellar fire and the silence of the void. Each of these encounters shared common threads that transcended the specific technologies, tactics, or civilizations involved. They represent something fundamental about the nature of conflict when pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional possibility. What truly made these battles impossible was not their scale, though some involved fleets numbering in the thousands, nor their exotic locations, though they were fought in environments that seemed designed to prevent any form of organized combat. Rather, their impossibility lay in the transformation they demanded of those who fought them, the requirement that commanders, crews, and entire civilizations evolve beyond their established limitations in real time, under conditions where failure meant extinction. The common denominator across all 10 encounters was the presence of asymmetrical warfare taken to its logical extreme. In each case, conventional military wisdom suggested that the outcome was predetermined. The humans at Andromeda were outnumbered 300 to 30. The Vortians were fighting at the edge of a black hole against overwhelming odds, and the forces in the endless void were battling in conditions where victory itself was meaningless without the resources to exploit it. But impossibility, as these battles demonstrated, is often a failure of imagination rather than a mathematical certainty. When faced with extinction, the combatants discovered that the boundaries they had accepted as absolute technological limitations, environmental constraints, the fundamental laws of physics themselves were more flexible than they had believed. The impossible became possible through innovation born of desperation, tactics that emerged from necessity, and the kind of courage that only manifests when there are no alternatives to victory except annihilation. Perhaps most significantly, each battle revealed that advanced civilizations' greatest weaknesses often stem from their greatest strengths. The Aurelius Empire's perfect harmony made them vulnerable to chaos. The Mechanist Collective's technological integration became a liability when their systems failed, and the hegemonic empire's overwhelming numerical superiority was turned against them by enemies who understood how to make numbers meaningless. These conflicts also demonstrated the psychological dimensions of impossible warfare. Beyond the tactical innovations and environmental adaptations, each battle required its participants to abandon their preconceptions about what was possible, and embrace solutions that bordered on the insane. Admiral Rivera using a dying star as a weapon, Captain Chen creating temporal paradoxes to defeat superior enemies, and Commander Rodriguez sacrificing herself to teach her enemies about humanities were not the actions of rational military doctrine, but of individuals who had transcended conventional thinking entirely. The legacy of these impossible battles extends beyond their immediate outcomes to the fundamental lessons they teach about survival, innovation, and the nature of victory itself. They remind us that in the vast arena of space, where the distances are measured in light years, and the stakes encompass entire civilizations, the traditional metrics of military success appear numbers, advanced technology, strategic position, secondary to more fundamental qualities, adaptability, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcend mere survival. Most importantly, these chronicles demonstrate that impossibility is a challenge rather than a verdict. Every impossible battle was won by someone who refused to accept that victory was mathematically, tactically, or physically unattainable. They found ways to turn disadvantages into advantages, transformed hostile environments into allies, and discovered that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is the refusal to admit defeat. In the end, what makes these battles worthy of remembrance is not that they were impossible, but that they were fought and won anyway. They stand as monuments to the principle that in the infinite darkness of space, where silence reigns and death waits patiently between the stars, the greatest impossibility is not victory against overwhelming odds, it is the surrender of hope, innovation, and the eternal human conviction that there is always a way forward, no matter how desperate the circumstances appear. These 10 impossible battles remind us that the universe may be vast and uncaring, but it is not somewhere among the stars, in conflicts yet to be fought and challenges yet to be faced. Future commanders will study these accounts and draw inspiration from those who prove that impossibility is simply another enemy to be defeated through courage, intelligence, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest void, victory is always possible for those willing to pay its price. Asterisk thus concludes the Chronicles of Impossible. Space battles, stales of those who dared to fight when victory seemed beyond reach, and in doing so redefined what victory could mean. Asterisk